This is the image they told us we would never see, not in our lifetimes, not in the 78-year history of the post-war Western Alliance. 27 of the world's most powerful leaders, the heads of France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, every major NATO democracy you can name, touching down in Ottawa, Canada, on the morning of Wednesday, March 11th, 2026, for an emergency summit that was convened in secret, organized in 72 hours, and designed to do one thing above all else: function without the United States of America. No White House invitation, no State Department liaison, no Pentagon observer, no American flag at the table. Washington was not merely uninvited. Washington was explicitly, deliberately, and with surgical precision excluded. As of 9 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, leaders representing 31 nations, accounting for 58% of global GDP, are sitting inside a reinforced conference room at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, directly across the river from Ottawa, reviewing a framework document that, according to two senior diplomatic sources speaking to Reuters on background, includes language that would have been unthinkable 12 months ago. A mutual defense clause that does not require American authorization to invoke, a collective trade architecture that routes around U.S. tariff structures, and a new financial clearinghouse, working title, the Allied Monetary Facility, that would allow member nations to settle transactions in euros, yen, and Canadian dollars, bypassing the U.S. dollar entirely. We are talking about the beginning of the end of American financial primacy. We are talking about allies who no longer trust Washington to honor its commitments. We are talking about the most dramatic geopolitical realignment since the Cold War. And we are talking about it happening right now, 63 miles from the American border, while the administration is reportedly scrambling to understand how it didn't see this coming. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly what is happening in that building in Gatineau right now. We are going to explain who organized this, how they kept it secret, and what the 7-point framework document actually says. We are going to walk you through the specific mechanisms that would allow NATO to function without American leadership. And we are going to answer the question that every serious analyst in Washington is asking this morning. Is this the moment America lost the Western Alliance for good? Buckle up, because what is being decided in that room today will rewrite the rules of the world order your generation was born into. To understand why European and Pacific leaders are meeting in secret in Canada today, you have to understand the sequence of events that began on the evening of February 17th, 2026. That was the night that the administration delivered what has since been described by senior German officials in leaked cables obtained by Der Spiegel as an ultimatum. Not a negotiation, an ultimatum. Pay 5% of GDP in NATO defense contributions, nearly triple the existing 2% commitment, within 90 days, or the United States would begin a phased withdrawal of forward-deployed military assets from Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. That alone might have been survivable. Difficult, insulting, but survivable. But two things happened simultaneously that transformed a diplomatic dispute into an existential crisis. First, the administration publicly floated the annexation of Greenland, not as a strategic aspiration, not as a hypothetical, but as active policy. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen convened an emergency session of the Folketing the following morning. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen placed calls to his counterparts in Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw within hours. The calls were not about calming the situation. They were about contingency planning. Second, and here is what nobody in the American mainstream media is telling you this morning, 3 days after the Greenland statement, the administration quietly froze $4.3 billion in previously committed military aid to Ukraine, not through congressional action, not through formal policy revision, but through a unilateral executive hold placed by the Office of Management and Budget that bypassed the normal interagency notification process. The Ukrainians found out through a banking flag, not a phone call. The Europeans found out when Kiev contacted Brussels in a panic at 2 a.m. on February 20th. That was the breaking point, not the tariffs, not the NATO threats. The moment allies realized that existing commitments meant nothing, that the American word, backed by treaty and statute and 70 years of institutional trust, could be vacated by a budget office memo at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, that was the moment they began building the exit. Here is the technical architecture of what was constructed in the weeks that followed, And understanding this machinery is critical to grasping the full magnitude of what is happening today. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former Bank of England governor and Bank of Canada governor, one of the most sophisticated economic minds currently leading any democracy, reached out personally to French President Emmanuel Macron on February 23rd. The call lasted 47 minutes, according to Élysée Palace scheduling records obtained by Le Monde. The subject, not a press release, not a statement of concern, a framework. Carney proposed using existing G7 financial architecture as the scaffolding for a new settlement mechanism that could operate independently of U.S. dollar clearing systems. Macron agreed to a working group within 24 hours. By March 1st, that working group included finance ministry officials from 11 countries. By March 5th, it had grown to 19. The document they produced, 73 pages, classified at the national security level in 6 countries, but partially described to Reuters by 2 officials speaking without authorization, contains 7 working pillars. Pillar 1 is the Allied Monetary Facility. This is the mechanism that causes the most alarm in Washington financial circles. It would establish a multilateral currency settlement system, allowing member nations to conduct bilateral trade in their own currencies without routing through SWIFT's U.S. dollar-dominant architecture. The initial capitalization target is 800 billion euros. That number is not a misprint. 800 billion euros in committed reserves from founding members, designed to create enough liquidity depth to make the system functional from day one. Pillar 2 is a collective tariff response framework. If the United States imposes tariffs above a threshold, the leaked document specifies 15% as the trigger. Member nations agree to coordinate retaliatory measures simultaneously rather than individually. The economic logic is devastating in its simplicity. The U.S. can negotiate with France alone. The U.S. cannot easily negotiate against 27 coordinated economies hitting back in unison. Individual European retaliations have historically been manageable. Coordinated retaliation from 58% of global GDP is a different animal entirely. Pillar 3 is the Mutual Defense Compact, and here is where it really gets serious. The language, as described by sources familiar with the draft, does not dissolve NATO. It is not an anti-NATO document. It is something more subtle and more dangerous to American strategic interests, a supplemental collective defense agreement that allows signatories to invoke mutual aid obligations without requiring a consensus vote that includes the United States. In plain English, it means that if Russia moves on Estonia tomorrow, the Allied response no longer has to wait for Washington to give the green light. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Because what those 27 leaders are holding in their hands today is not just an emergency response document. According to a former senior NSC official who spoke to Politico this morning on condition of anonymity, the Ottawa framework was partially modeled on contingency planning documents that existed within European defense ministries since as early as 2017. Documents that were updated, expanded, and quietly activated when it became clear that American reliability could no longer be assumed as a constant. The source put it this way, and I want you to hear this carefully. The Europeans have had a drawer for this. They hoped they would never open it. They opened it. Think about what that means. The most powerful military and economic alliance in human history has been quietly preparing for nearly a decade for the scenario where America becomes the variable rather than the foundation. The drawer existed, the documents existed, the relationships existed. All that was required was the political will to act, and February 2026 provided that will in abundance. Here is the list of confirmed attendees as of this morning, and this list alone tells you everything. French President Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Italian Prime Minister Meloni, Polish President Duda, the NATO Secretary General, the President of the European Commission, and 21 additional heads of state or government from across the alliance. Japan's attendance is particularly significant. Japan is not a NATO member. Japan has its own bilateral defense treaty with the United States. For Japan to send its prime minister to a summit explicitly designed to reduce American institutional leverage, that is a strategic signal of the highest order. Tokyo is hedging, and when Tokyo hedges, the entire Pacific calculus shifts. The administration's response this morning has been, and I'm going to be precise here, incoherent. The White House press office released a statement at 7:42 a.m. Eastern describing the summit as a friendly multilateral dialogue among allies and expressing confidence that the transatlantic relationship remains strong. The Secretary of State, speaking to reporters on the tarmac at Dulles, called the meeting routine consultation among partners. Neither statement addressed the Allied Monetary Facility. Neither statement addressed the mutual defense language. Neither statement acknowledged that the United States was not invited. Sources inside the State Department, and there are multiple, all speaking without authorization because the communications lockdown at Foggy Bottom this morning is, according to one career Foreign Service officer, unlike anything I have seen in 31 years, describe a building in controlled panic. The director of policy planning reportedly drafted a memo overnight recommending immediate high-level bilateral outreach to Paris and Berlin. That memo was, according to two sources, returned without action. The Deputy Secretary of State requested an emergency call with the Canadian Foreign Minister. The request was acknowledged, but not scheduled. Let me translate that for you. The number 2 diplomat in the United States government asked Canada for an urgent conversation. Canada said, effectively, we'll get back to you. That is not an oversight. That is a message. And here's where the stakes move from diplomatic to constitutional. Because buried inside the Ottawa framework, in Pillar 6, according to the Reuters sourcing, is language that would formalize the transfer of certain NATO command and control planning functions to a European-led structure headquartered in Brussels, not in Mons, Belgium, where U.S. generals have commanded the Supreme Allied Commander Europe role since 1951. For 75 years, an American officer has held that command. The Ottawa document envisions a rotation system. The first non-American Supreme Allied Commander under the new structure would be a German general. The transition timeline, 18 months. This is not a symbolic adjustment. Supreme Allied Command Europe coordinates nuclear planning, forward deployment, and Article 5 response protocols for the entire alliance. Removing American primacy from that command is the structural equivalent of changing the locks on the house while the owner is away. It is legal. It is within the authority of member states. And it would fundamentally alter the American security position in Europe in ways that no amount of subsequent diplomacy can fully reverse. Don't go anywhere. Because the economic dimension of what is happening today dwarfs even the military implications. Here is the number that the Treasury Department does not want you to focus on this morning. The U.S. dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from 72% in 2001 to 58% in 2024. That 14-point decline over 2 decades happened gradually, almost invisibly, driven by normal reserve diversification. What the Allied Monetary Facility proposes to do is compress a decade of further dollar reserve decline into a period of roughly 3 to 5 years by creating an institutional infrastructure that actively incentivizes dollar avoidance rather than merely accommodating it. The mechanism works like this. When a French company wants to buy components from a Japanese supplier, today that transaction almost certainly routes through dollar-denominated clearing. It is not ideological. It is mechanical. The pipes are built for dollars. The Allied Monetary Facility builds new pipes. Once the pipes exist and are capitalized at 800 billion euros of committed reserves, the friction of using those pipes drops close to zero. And once the friction drops, the behavior changes. Not immediately, not overnight, but irreversibly. Former Federal Reserve Vice Chair Richard Clarida, speaking on Bloomberg television this morning, described the facility as the most serious structural challenge to dollar primacy since Bretton Woods. That is not hyperbole. Bretton Woods in 1944 established the dollar as the world's reserve currency. What is being designed in Gatineau today is its partial, deliberate, institutional replacement. The cascading implications are not abstract. Dollar primacy is what allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits without triggering a currency crisis. It is what allows the federal government to finance its $36 trillion debt at rates lower than any other nation of comparable indebtedness could command. It is what makes U.S. Treasury bonds the world's safe haven asset. Erode dollar primacy by even 10 percentage points of reserve share, and the U.S. borrowing cost on its national debt rises. Federal Reserve economists estimated in a 2023 internal paper, portions of which were published in academic form, that each 10% decline in dollar reserve share increases long-term U.S. borrowing costs by approximately 35 to 50 basis points. On $36 trillion in debt, 50 basis points is $180 billion per year in additional interest expense every year permanently. That is the hidden cost of what is happening in that building in Gatineau this morning, and the administration has not said a single word about it. Here is what nobody in cable television is telling you right now. The Ottawa summit is not the beginning of this process. It is the public face of something that has been accelerating for 8 weeks below the waterline. 3 specific events in February 2026 functioned as quiet tripwires, each one compressing the Allied timeline toward action. Tripwire 1. On February 12th, the administration informed the German government through back channels, not through formal diplomatic communication, but through a defense industry intermediary, that U.S. fighter jet component export licenses for the Eurofighter program would be subject to review. Germany produces components for American weapon systems. The United States produces components for German weapon systems. The relationship is deeply interdependent. The suggestion that those licenses might be weaponized was received in Berlin, according to a senior German defense ministry official speaking to Der Spiegel, as a declaration of economic hostage-taking. Tripwire 2. On February 19th, the White House Chief of Staff, in a background briefing to American defense industry executives, described NATO's Article 5 mutual defense guarantee as contingent on member financial contributions. Article 5 has never, in 75 years, been described as contingent on anything. It is absolute. It is the bedrock. Framing it as conditional was heard in every European capital, not as a negotiating position, but as a fundamental renegotiation of the alliance's existential premise. Tripwire 3. On February 24th, and this is the one that closed the circuit, Ukrainian President Zelensky, in a private call with French President Macron, described what had happened when the $4.3 billion aid freeze hit Kiev's accounts. He used a phrase that French officials have since quietly repeated in allied circles. "We learned we were alone from a banking notification." That phrase, "we learned we were alone from a banking notification," traveled through European foreign ministries like electricity through a wet wire. And here's where it really gets serious. Because the Allied response to those 3 tripwires was not emotional. It was not reactive. The Ottawa summit is the product of 8 weeks of precise, deliberate, institutional engineering by some of the most experienced economic and strategic minds operating in democratic governance today. Mark Carney ran central banks for 2 of the world's major economies. Friedrich Merz spent 30 years in international corporate finance before entering politics. Emmanuel Macron served as a senior investment banker at Rothschild and was France's economy minister at 37. Keir Starmer was director of public prosecutions. These are not sentiment-driven actors. These are technocrats who understand leverage, institutional design, and the difference between a negotiating threat and a structural commitment. When people with those credentials build a financial architecture designed to reduce American leverage, they are not making a statement. They are building a machine. And machines, once built and capitalized and operationalized, do not unbuild themselves because the diplomatic weather changes. The administration faces a dilemma that has no clean solution. Option 1, engage, acknowledge the summit, request inclusion in a follow-on process, and negotiate modifications to the framework before it is finalized. The problem is that engagement legitimizes the framework. It acknowledges that the Allies had sufficient cause to build an alternative architecture. It is a concession of strategic failure. Option 2, condemn. Declare the summit a hostile act, threaten trade consequences, and attempt to fracture the coalition through bilateral pressure. The problem is that the administration has already burned most of its bilateral leverage. Germany has absorbed tariff threats. France has absorbed public humiliation. Canada is hosting the summit. Japan attended. There is no obvious lever to pull that hasn't already been pulled and proven insufficient. Option 3, ignore. Treat the Ottawa summit as a temporary aberration, maintain the fiction that allied relationships are fundamentally strong, and wait for the coalition to fracture on its own internal contradictions. The problem is that the allied monetary facility requires institutional commitment. 800 billion euros of committed reserves do not appear and disappear casually. Once governments have politically committed those reserves, domestic political constituencies have formed around the decision. Reversing it becomes domestically costly for every individual member government. There is no option 4. We have covered wars, impeachments, financial crises, and constitutional confrontations. What is happening today is different in kind, not just in degree. Those other crises were inflection points within the existing order. The Ottawa summit is a question about whether the existing order continues. The Western Alliance was not a natural formation. It was a deliberate construction, built in the years after 1945 by American statesmen, Marshall, Acheson, Kennan, Eisenhower, who understood that American security and American prosperity depended on creating an institutional framework that bound democratic nations together with genuine mutual obligation. The Marshall Plan, NATO, Bretton Woods, the GATT, the IMF. All of it was constructed with the understanding that American leadership required American reliability, that America's word had to mean something, that the institutions had to be more durable than any individual administration's preferences. What those 27 leaders are debating today in Gatineau is what happens when reliability is no longer assumed. They are not anti-American. The evidence suggests the opposite. They are trying to preserve an alliance architecture that an American administration appears determined to dismantle. But the act of preservation, the institutional infrastructure being built to allow the alliance to function without American anchoring, creates facts on the ground that reshape the relationship regardless of intent. Here is the final question, and it is the question that should keep every American who cares about this country's position in the world awake tonight. If the Allied Monetary Facility is capitalized, if the Mutual Defense Compact is signed, if the Saussure rotation is implemented, if those 3 structural changes become operational facts, what does the United States have left as the indispensable nation? What is the argument 5 years from now for why the dollar remains the world's reserve currency if a 58% of global GDP coalition has built alternative plumbing? What is the argument for American strategic primacy in Europe if European defense planning no longer requires American authorization? What is the argument for the American-led international order if the order's principal beneficiaries have concluded that American leadership has become a liability rather than an asset? These are not partisan questions. They are not Republican questions or Democrat questions. They are American questions. Questions about the infrastructure of prosperity and security that generations of Americans, your parents, your grandparents, built at enormous cost and sustained at enormous sacrifice. Questions about whether your grandchildren inherit a world where American strength is a given or a memory. As of this evening, the summit in Gatineau continues. A joint communiqué is expected tomorrow morning. The Allied Monetary Facility Working Group has a drafting session scheduled for Thursday. The mutual defense language goes to legal review by Friday. This is not a photo opportunity. This is a construction project. And when that building is finished, the neighborhood will look different. Watch the communiqué language carefully. Watch whether the word independent appears in the defense clause. Watch whether any administration official is given a courtesy briefing before the document is released. Watch whether Canada returns the Deputy Secretary of State's call. Each of those signals will tell you whether the door is still ajar or whether it has already closed. The image from Ottawa this morning, 27 leaders in a room without an American, is not a protest. It is a blueprint. And blueprints become buildings. Subscribe. Stay close. The architecture of the world your children will inhabit is being drawn right now, 63 miles from the American border, in a room Washington wasn't invited into.